My name is Amy. I'm 32 years old and I learned early that hunger sharpens the mind in ways privilege never could. In the cramped apartment above the laundromat where my mother worked 16-hour days, I discovered that necessity breeds a particular kind of intelligence. One that sees patterns in chaos, opportunities in obstacles, and weapons in the very systems designed to exclude you. The scholarship letter arrived on a Tuesday. I remember the weight of the paper, expensive and cream-colored, so different from the thin bills and notices that usually slipped under our door. Yale University, full academic scholarship. The culmination of years spent studying by streetlight when our electricity was cut, of walking 4 miles to the library because bus fare meant skipping lunch, of turning every disadvantage into fuel for an ambition that burned so bright it sometimes frightened me. My mother cried that day, not the exhausted tears I sometimes caught her hiding, but something closer to release. She held that letter like it was made of spun gold, and perhaps it was. It represented escape, not just from poverty, but from the generational curse of invisible labor, of bent backs and worn hands, of dreams deferred until they calcified into regret. I believed then in the mythology of meritocracy. I believed that intelligence and dedication were skeleton keys that could unlock any door, that the only barriers between me and success were the ones I could overcome through sheer force of will. This naivety would cost me dearly, but it would also, in time, become the foundation of something far more powerful than mere success. Yale welcomed me with Gothic towers and manicured lawns, with libraries that smelled of leather and old paper, with dining halls where food appeared in abundance and variety I had never imagined, but it also welcomed me with 1,000 subtle reminders that I was a guest in someone else's house. The way conversations paused when I mentioned working summers at the factory, the careful distance maintained when group projects were assigned, the surprise poorly concealed when I outperformed legacy students who had been groomed for this place since birth. I learned to modulate my voice to soften the edges of consonants sharpened by necessity. I studied not just my coursework, but the intricate social choreography of the elite, their references, their assumptions, their casual cruelties dressed as humor. I became fluent in their language while never forgetting my mother tongue, the dialect of survival. It was in my 3rd year that I met Professor Catherine Whitmore. She was everything I aspired to be: brilliant, accomplished, respect. Her lectures on behavioral economics were performances, each concept unveiled with the precision of a surgeon and the flair of a magician. When she selected me as her research assistant, I felt as though I had finally crossed some invisible threshold. I was no longer merely surviving in their world, I was contributing to it. The project consumed me. We were developing a new model for predicting consumer behavior in emerging markets, focusing on communities that traditional economic theories had failed to understand, communities like the one I had grown up in. I brought insights that no amount of academic study could have provided. I knew why people chose certain products not based on quality or price, but on complex social signals. I understood the underground economies that flourished in the shadows of legitimate commerce. I translated the unwritten rules of survival into algorithms and equations. Professor Whitmore was fascinated. She would sit across from me in her office, with its wall of awards and framed photographs with notable economists, and listen with an intensity that made me feel visible for the first time. She asked probing questions, pushed me to articulate theories I had only intuited, helped me transform lived experience into academic gold. The breakthrough came during winter break of my senior year. While my classmates traveled to ski resorts and European capitals, I remained on the nearly empty campus, refining our model. It was then that I discovered the connection between social trust networks in marginalized communities and their purchasing patterns. The insight was elegant in its simplicity, revolutionary in its implications. It could transform how companies marketed to the billions of people living at the economic margins, but more importantly, it could help these communities leverage their collective power. I worked through Christmas and New Year, surviving on vending machine coffee and cafeteria leftovers. By the time Professor Whitmore returned in January, I had a complete theoretical framework, supported by data analysis that drew from sources no traditional economist would have thought to consult. She reviewed my work with barely concealed excitement, her fingers drumming against her desk as she absorbed the implications. The paper was published in March, 3 months before my graduation. A new paradigm for economic behavior in marginalized communities appeared in the Quarterly Journal of Economics under a single name, Catherine Whitmore. In the acknowledgments buried in the final paragraph, she thanked the undergraduate students who assisted with data collection. I stood in the library, holding the journal with hands that barely trembled, reading and rereading the byline as if it might change. The words were mine, entire paragraphs lifted verbatim from my note. The insights were mine, born from nights when hunger was a familiar companion, from watching my mother calculate pennies at the grocery store, from understanding that poverty was not a lack of intelligence, but a lack of access. But the credit, the career-defining breakthrough that would lead to book deals and consulting contracts and speaking fees, belonged to someone who had never known what it meant to choose between electricity and medicine. When I confronted her, Professor Whitmore's office felt smaller than I remembered. She sat behind her desk, that massive oak barrier between us, and explained with patient condescension that this was how academic collaboration worked. Senior researchers guided the work, junior assistants learned by contributing. The experience itself, she assured me, was invaluable. The recommendation letter she would write would open doors. This was the price of admission to the club. I could have filed complaints, made accusations, demanded justice through official channels, but I had learned enough about how institutions protect their own to know how that story would end. A promising student, overcome by the pressure of her final year, misunderstanding the nature of academic mentorship. Perhaps some mental health support would help. Perhaps she wasn't quite ready for the rigors of this environment, so I smiled. I thanked her for the opportunity. I attended the conference where she presented our work, my work, to thunderous applause. I sat in the audience, anonymous among the graduate students and junior faculty, and watched her accept congratulations, with the grace of someone who had never doubted their right to claim whatever they desired. Graduation came with summa cum laude honors, and no job prospect. The recommendation letter Professor Whitmore provided was lukewarm, carefully worded to damn with faint praise. The positions I had dreamed of at think tanks, research institutions, innovative companies, went to classmates with half my ability but twice my connection. I returned to the apartment above the laundromat, diploma in hand, and considered my options. It would have been easy to let bitterness consume me, to add my name to the long list of brilliant minds, ground down by systems designed to extract their value while denying their worth. But I had not survived this long by choosing easy paths. Instead, I chose something far more dangerous: patience. I took a job at a small financial firm in the city, the kind of place that hired hungry graduates willing to work brutal hours for minimal pay. It was not the triumphant entry into the professional world I had imagined, but it served my purposes. I learned how money really moved, how power was accumulated and exercised, how the same people who had excluded me in academia built and maintained their influence in the business world. The firm specialized in emerging market investments, and my unusual background, the very thing that had marked me as an outsider at Yale, became an asset. I could analyze opportunities in developing economies with an understanding that went beyond spreadsheets and market reports. I knew how communities functioned when formal systems failed, how trust was built and maintained outside traditional institutions, how value was created in places the established order had written off as worthless. My success was quiet but steady. I made the firm money by seeing what others missed, by recognizing patterns that required fluency in both worlds, the one I had been born into and the one I had fought to enter. But I was careful never to appear too successful, never to threaten those above me who might feel entitled to claim my achievements as their own. I had learned that lesson well. In the evenings, in the small apartment I rented in a neighborhood that straddled respectability and struggle, I began building something of my own. Using the theoretical framework I had developed, the one that now bore Professor Whitmore's name, I created models for community investment that bypassed traditional financial institutions. I identified networks of trust, mapped flows of informal capital, found ways to inject resources, that multiplied rather than extracted value. The first project was small, a lending circle in my old neighborhood that formalized existing practices of mutual support, but it worked. Money flowed to people who needed it, was repaid at rates that would have astonished conventional lenders, created opportunities that rippled outward in unexpected ways. I expanded quietly, building a network of similar projects, always operating below the radar of those who might try to co-opt or corrupt what I was creating. It was during this time that I began to understand revenge not as a single act of retaliation, but as an architecture, something that required foundation, structure, and most importantly, time. The injury Professor Whitmore had inflicted was not merely personal, it was representative of an entire system that consumed the innovations of the excluded, while denying them entry. My response, therefore, could not be merely personal either, it had to be systemic. 5 years after graduation, I attended a conference on economic development. Professor Whitmore was the keynote speaker, her reputation now international, her theories, my theories, influencing policy at the highest level. I sat in the back row, unrecognizable in my carefully chosen suit, my practiced professional demeanor. She spoke eloquently about understanding marginalized communities, about the need for new perspectives, about innovation coming from unexpected places. The irony was so thick it could have been cut with a knife. During the networking reception, I approached her. She looked through me at first, her gaze sliding past as she searched for more important connections. When I introduced myself using my full name, there was a moment, brief but unmistakable, when recognition flickered in her eyes, then the professional smile, the vague pleasantries, the careful distance. She had forgotten me, or chosen to forget, which amounted to the same thing. But I had not forgotten. Every detail of that office, that conversation, that betrayal remained crystal clear. What she didn't know was that her work, my work, had evolved far beyond what she had published. The frameworks I continued to develop had grown more sophisticated, more powerful, more capable of creating real change, and I had been patient enough to build the infrastructure to deploy them. The opportunity came, as opportunities often do, disguised as coincidence. Professor Whitmore's consulting firm, built on the reputation of that stolen research, was bidding for a major contract with the World Bank. They needed to demonstrate practical applications of their theories in real communities, to show measurable impact beyond academic speculation. Through a series of connections I had cultivated over the years, people who remembered where they came from, who understood the importance of lifting as you climb, I learned the details of their proposal. It was ambitious but flawed. They planned to implement programs based on the original research, but their understanding was surface level, lacking the crucial insights that came from lived experience. They would fail, but not immediately. First, they would secure the contract, invest resources, make promises to vulnerable communities. Then, when the programs faltered, they would blame implementation issues, cultural barriers, the communities themselves. It was a cycle I had seen repeated countless times: extract the knowledge, fumble the application, assign blame downward. I positioned my own organization, now a respected player in community development finance, to offer an alternative approach. We had years of proven success, testimonials from communities that had been transformed, data that showed sustainable, scalable impact. But more importantly, we had something Professor Whitmore's firm could never replicate: authentic connection to the communities we serve. The competition was fierce. Professor Whitmore's firm had every advantage: reputation, connections, the kind of institutional credibility that opened doors before you knocked. But I had been preparing for this moment for years, building relationships with the mid-level bureaucrats, who actually evaluated proposals, establishing credibility through consistent results, rather than academic pedigree, creating a track record that spoke louder than any theory. When the World Bank announced their decision, choosing our organization over Professor Whitmore's established firm, the shockwaves rippled through the development economics community. How had an unknown organization, led by someone without an advanced degree or prestigious publications, outmaneuvered one of the field's most respected names? The answer was simple, though few would understand it. I had been playing a different game entirely. While Professor Whitmore had built her career on a foundation of extracted knowledge, I had built mine on the application of that knowledge, by and for the communities it claimed to serve. She had the map, I had traveled the territory. the contract was only the beginning. As our program succeeded, lifting thousands out of poverty by working with rather than on communities, our reputation grew. Other organizations sought our expertise, funding flowed from sources that had previously been inaccessible. We expanded, carefully and strategically, always maintaining our connection to the ground, always remembering that our power came from understanding, rather than exploiting the communities we served. Professor Whitmore's firm struggled to understand what had happened. They had lost not just a contract, but their position as the preeminent authority in the field. Their subsequent proposals were compared unfavorably to our results. Their theoretical frameworks, unchanged since that original stolen research, seemed increasingly out of touch. The speaking invitations dried up, the consulting contracts went elsewhere. The empire built on my extracted labor crumbled, not through any direct attack, but through the simple act of being surpassed by something more authentic, more effective, more true. I could have revealed the truth then. I had kept meticulous records, early drafts with timestamp data, emails, discussing concepts that later appeared in her published work, notebooks filled with the insights that had launched her career. A well-timed exposé would have destroyed what remained of her reputation, but I found that I no longer needed that satisfaction. The revenge I had crafted was more complete than any public humiliation could have been. I had not just reclaimed my work, I had transcended it. The final act came at another conference, 10 years after that first betrayal. I was now the keynote speaker, invited to share insights from a decade of successful community development initiatives. The organizers had also invited Professor Whitmore to provide academic context, unaware of our history. She sat in the front row, her face a carefully composed mask as I presented innovations that built upon but far exceeded the foundations she had stolen. I spoke about the evolution of economic theory when it was grounded in genuine understanding, rather than academic extraction. I presented case studies from communities that had transformed themselves, using tools designed by people who understood their struggles intimately. I never mentioned her name, never referenced that original paper, but anyone familiar with the field could trace the lineage of ideas and see how far they had traveled from their origins. After my presentation, she approached me during the reception. The crowd parted respectfully. I was now someone whose attention was sought, whose time was valuable. She stood before me, older, diminished somehow, the confidence that had once seemed unshakable now brittle around the edge. She spoke carefully about collaboration, about how academic work builds upon itself, about the importance of mentorship. I listened with the same patience I had cultivated over the years, the patience that had allowed me to build rather than merely tear down. When she finished, I smiled, not the bitter smile of the wronged, but the serene smile of someone who had moved beyond the need for acknowledgement from those who had failed to see their work. I spoke briefly about the importance of authentic engagement with communities, about how true innovation came from listening to those whose voices were often ignored, about the responsibility that came with interpreting and presenting the experiences of others. I wished her well in her future endeavors, genuinely and without irony. Then I turned to continue a conversation with a young researcher who had approached with questions about implementation strategies, leaving Professor Whitmore standing alone in a crowd that had already forgotten her presence. The architecture of my revenge was complete, but it was no longer about her. It had become something larger, a restructuring of the very systems that had allowed such extraction to flourish. Every successful program we implemented, every community that lifted itself, using tools designed by people who understood their reality, every young researcher who learned that authentic engagement was more valuable than academic exploitation, was another brick in a new foundation. My mother lived to see my success, though she never fully understood its scope. To her I had simply fulfilled the promise of that scholarship letter, escaped poverty, achieved stability, helped others do the same. She didn't need to know about the years of patient planning, the careful accumulation of power, the strategic dismantling of systems that had tried to use and discard us. She only needed to know that her daughter had not just survived but had transformed survival into something approaching justice. I sometimes wonder if Professor Whitmore ever fully understood what happened. Did she recognize, in those final years of her diminished career,
that the innovations she had claimed had grown beyond her grasp? Did she understand that revenge could be not just personal but generational, not just destructive but creative? Or did she, like so many who operate from positions of unexamined privilege, simply attribute her declining fortunes to changing times, never recognizing the architecture that had been carefully constructed around her? It doesn't matter. The ledger is balanced, not through her understanding, but through the thousands of lives transformed by programs she could never have created, through the young researchers who learned to collaborate rather than extract, through the communities that have reclaimed their own narratives, and the economic power that flows from them. This is the mathematics of true revenge, not subtraction, but multiplication, not tearing down but building up, not personal vindication, but systemic transformation. I work now from an office with floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the city. It's not ostentatious. I learned long ago that true power doesn't need to announce itself, but it's several floors above the cramped apartment where I first dreamed of escape. On my desk, among the policy papers and project proposals, I keep a single reminder of where this journey began, a photocopy of that original research, the ideas that were mine presented under another's name. I no longer feel anger when I look at it. Instead, I feel something closer to gratitude. That betrayal, painful as it was, taught me lessons no university could have provided. It showed me how power operated, how systems of extraction perpetuated themselves, how the brilliant innovations of the marginalized were consistently claimed by those who already had too much. But more importantly, it taught me that these systems were not immutable. They could be understood, navigated, and ultimately transformed. The young people who come through our programs now, brilliant minds from backgrounds like mine, carrying insights born from struggle, will not face the same battle. We have created pathways that didn't exist, models of success that don't require surrendering your voice to those who would claim it as their own. They will face other challenges, certainly, but they will not have to choose between invisibility and exploitation. They will not have to smile while watching others accept applause for their work. They will not have to spend years crafting elaborate architectures of revenge because the structures that necessitated such architectures have been quietly, carefully, systematically dismantled. This is the final victory, not that I recovered what was stolen, but that I created conditions where such theft becomes increasingly impossible. Every community that controls its own economic narrative, every young researcher who maintains ownership of their insight, every innovation that flows from the margins to transform the center, without losing its authenticity. These are the interest payments on a debt that can never be fully collected, because its impact transcended the original injury. Power, I have learned, is not about what you can take but about what you can build. Justice is not about punishment, but about prevention. And revenge, in its highest form, is not about destroying those who wronged you but about creating a world where they can no longer wrong others. I think about that young woman sometimes, standing in Professor Whitmore's office, swallowing rage and humiliation, choosing patience over protest. I want to tell her that it will be worth it, that the architecture she begins sketching in that moment of betrayal will eventually house not just her own success, but the dreams of countless others. I want to tell her that revenge and justice can be synonymous, if you're willing to play a long enough game. I want to tell her that the hunger that sharpened her mind will eventually feed multitudes, but she already knows. Even in that moment of loss, she is beginning to see the patterns, to recognize the opportunities hidden within the obstacles, to understand that the very systems designed to exclude her contain the seeds of their own transformation. She is learning that patience is not passive but creative, that building takes longer than destroying but lasts infinitely longer, that the best revenge is a life and a legacy that transcends the imagination of those who tried to limit you. The city lights stretch out below my window, each one representing a life, a story, a possibility. Somewhere among them, a young person is discovering that their insights have value, that their experiences matter, that their innovations can transform rather than be transformed by the systems they encounter. Somewhere a community is leveraging collective power in ways that economic theory is only beginning to understand. Somewhere the architecture of justice is being expanded, one carefully placed brick at a time. This is my revenge, not a monument to personal vindication, but a living structure that continues to grow, adapt and shelter those who come after. It is revenge elevated to the level of revolution, patient enough to play out over generations, strategic enough to transform systems, rather than merely navigate them, cold in its execution, but warm in its ultimate purpose. The phone rings, another opportunity, another chance to expand the architecture, another brick to lay in foundations that will outlast us all. I answer with the same calm professionalism I cultivated all those years ago, but now it comes from genuine peace rather than suppressed rage. The work continues, the patterns evolve, the architecture expands, and somewhere in an office that once seemed so imposing, a professor contemplates the trajectory of a career built on extracted brilliance, wondering perhaps where it all went wrong, never quite understanding that it was not a collapse but a careful dismantling, not a failure but a transcendence, not an ending, but a transformation, that began the moment she chose to claim what was not hers to take. The architecture of revenge is complete, but the architecture of justice is never finished. It grows with each young mind that refuses to be silenced, each community that claims its own power, each innovation that remains rooted in its authentic source. This is the mathematics I learned in that cramped apartment above the laundromat, refined in Gothic towers I was never meant to enter, and finally applied in the real world where transformation is not theoretical but tangible, not extracted but generated, not stolen but shared.
The city sleeps, but the work continues. Tomorrow there will be new proposals to review, new communities to engage, new minds to mentor. The architecture expands, patient and inexorable, built on foundations that no amount of privilege can shake, because they are rooted, not in individual grievance, but in collective possibility. This is revenge in its purest form, a future that makes the past irrelevant, a success that redefines the very terms of engagement, a power that flows from understanding rather than exploitation. It is cold in its strategy, but warm in its impact, calculating in its execution, but generous in its results, personal in its origins, but universal in its implications. The ledger is balanced, but the accounting continues. Each success multiplies rather than merely adds. Each transformation creates possibilities that exponentially expand. Each young person who sees a path that doesn't require self-betrayal is both vindication and investment, both closure and opening, both ending and beginning. I close my eyes and see not Professor Whitmore's office, but the countless offices where young people now sit, as equals rather than supplicants, where collaboration means shared credit, where innovation is attributed to its true sources. I see communities writing their own economic narratives, researchers building on foundations of authentic engagement, systems transforming from within, through the patient work of those who understand them intimately. This is my revenge. Not a cry of rage, but a quiet revolution. Not a single victory, but an endless series of small triumphs. Not personal satisfaction, but generational transformation. It is revenge elevated to the level of architecture, structured, purposeful, built to last. The night deepens, but I am not tired. There is too much work to be done, too many possibilities to explore, too many architectures to build. Each day brings new opportunities to expand the foundation, to add another floor to the structure, to create spaces where others can build their own architectures of transformation. And in the end, this is perhaps the sweetest revenge of all, that it no longer feels like revenge at all, but simply like justice, patiently and strategically achieved, multiplying endlessly outward, like ripples on water, transforming everything it touches, including, and perhaps especially, the one who set it in motion. The architecture stands, elegant and unshakable, a testament not to what was taken, but to what was built in response. It is my legacy, my revenge, my gift to those who come after. It is proof that patience wedded to purpose can transform injury into innovation, exclusion into expansion, extraction into generation. The city wakes, and with it new possibility. The architecture of revenge is complete, but the architecture of justice continues to rise, floor by floor, brick by brick, dream by carefully realized dream. This is the mathematics of transformation, not mere addition, but multiplication, not simple construction, but complex creation, not individual triumph, but collective transcendence. And I, who once stood powerless in an office that seemed to contain all the authority in the world, now stand in my own space, surrounded not by tokens of personal achievement, but by evidence of systemic change. The view from here is vast and growing, vaster, each new project expanding the horizon, each success creating new possibilities for success. This is revenge perfected, so complete it transcends its own origins, so strategic it appears effortless, so transformative it renders the original injury almost irrelevant, not forgotten, never forgotten, but transformed into fuel for something far greater than personal vindication. The phone rings again. Another opportunity, another chance to build, another brick in the ever-expanding architecture of justice. I answer with the calm certainty of someone who has learned that the best revenge is not destruction, but creation, not subtraction, but multiplication, not ending but endless beginning. The work continues, the architecture rises, the transformation spreads, and someone, in the shadows of systems that once seemed immutable, another young person is learning that their insights have value, their experiences matter, their innovations can change the world, if they're patient enough, strategic enough, willing to play a game whose rules they write themselves. This is my revenge, a world transformed, one carefully planned project at a time, one patiently nurtured relationship at a time, one strategic victory at a time. It is revenge as architecture, justice as mathematics, transformation as the ultimate form of transcendence. The sun rises over the city, illuminating possibilities that didn't exist yesterday, that might not have existed at all, if not for a betrayal that taught me to build rather than burn, to multiply rather than subtract, to transform rather than merely survive. This is the architecture of revenge, beautiful in its complexity, terrible in its completeness, magnificent in its impact. It stands as proof that those who would extract the brilliance of others should beware, not because vengeance is swift, but because it is patient, not because justice is loud, but because it is quiet, not because transformation is dramatic, but because it is inexorable. The ledger is balanced, the architecture is complete, the future, built on foundations they never saw being laid, rises inevitably toward a horizon they can no longer define or control. This is my revenge. This is my gift to every brilliant mind that was ever told its insights belonged to someone else, every innovation that was claimed by those who could never have conceived it, every dreamer who was taught that the price of admission was silence. The architecture stands, and it is beautiful. Have you ever been underestimated? Have your ideas ever been taken, your worth ignored, just because you didn't fit their mold? If you've ever been told to stay quiet, to stay small, to be grateful for scraps, then you already know, this story isn't just mine, if this journey spoke to you, if you've ever dreamed of rewriting the rules instead of playing by theirs, then like this video, leave a comment and subscribe, because there are more stories to tell, more systems to change, and more architectures to build. Together, the transformation has only just begun.